Welcome back, everyone. Spring and summer is a time for new growth and taking bold action together. So we hope these stories can inspire you to live boldly, take wise chances, and with our friends and family, make a difference together. Today we will be reading The Adventures of Wishbone, Digging to the Center of the Earth by Michael Anthony Steele, inspired by A Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. So lean in with a spirit of adventure, grab a friend, and let's enjoy the story together. Chapter 8. Professor Lindenbrock watched with concern as Axel struggled to regain consciousness. He was lying on the ground, covered with a blanket. A bandage was wrapped around his head. There was a small spot of blood seeping through just above his left eye. They were inside a small opening surrounded by several large rocks. We always have to push it to the edge. Is that okay. Is that necessary? Yes, it is, she says. Terriers. What are you going to do? They were inside a small opening surrounded by several large rocks. The professor placed one paw onto his nephew's arm. When he saw him move, Axel slowly opened his eyes. He lives! He lives! The professor exclaimed. Yes, my good uncle, Axel whispered. Professor Lindenbrock's tail wagged. My dear boy, he said, you are saved. Hans looked over the professor's shoulder. Good dog, he said quickly. Then he left the small area of circled boulders. Good day, Hans, good day, Axel called after him in a stronger voice. Professor watched Axel as he looked around. The different surroundings seemed to confuse him. What happened, Uncle? Axel asked. After you were separated from Hans and me, Professor Lindenbrock said, you must have fallen down a shaft in the tunnel. When Hans and I found you, you had an injury to your head. You've been unconscious for a whole day. Even though Hans picked you up and carried you here, I feared you might never wake up. Professor placed a paw on Axel's chest. I thought I might lose you, dear nephew. No journey is worth that. Axel smiled as he placed a hand on his uncle's paw. His attention then shifted to his surroundings. Uncle, he began, I see no lamp lit and no torch burning. This is true, the professor answered. His excitement grew as he gazed around this bright area. Axel continued, Yet everything is bright. Yes, Professor said, his tail beginning to wag. And Uncle, Axel said as he began to sit up, I'm sure I can hear a low murmur, like the washing of waves upon sand. Professor's tail wagged with more force. It was very difficult for him to keep from telling Axel where they were, but he was determined for Axel to enjoy the discovery, just the way he and Hans had. Axel spoke again. Uncle, I do believe I can hear the sighing of the wind. Yes, Professor answered. All of what you say is true. A concerned look made Axel's face tighten. He touched the bandage on his head. It is my opinion that my head is not exactly right. In fact, I do believe myself slightly delirious. Trying to hold back laughter, the professor replied, Axel, dear boy, you are not delirious. Then, Uncle, Axel said, did we return to the surface of the earth? Certainly not, Professor replied, surprised by the question. How then do you explain all these things? The nephew asked. I will not even try to explain, Professor Lindenbrock said. The whole matter is completely unexplainable. He turned and began to trot toward a place where there was an opening in the group of large boulders that almost completely surrounded them. Come, Axel, you shall judge for yourself. Axel rose, placing his hand on one of the boulders for support. He slowly followed his uncle. Professor said, You'll then find that geological science still holds many mysteries, and we are going to educate the world. As Professor stepped out from behind the boulders, he turned back to watch Axel's expression. His nephew came out, and the bright light made him squint. After a few seconds, his eyes widened at what he saw. Professor followed his nephew's gaze. Axel, dear boy, you are looking at the Central Sea. Professor Lindenbrock's tail wagged as if he were viewing the scene for the first time. They were in a huge cavern. The size was impossible to calculate. A vast, limitless sea of water spread out before them for miles. Its waves gently broke against a shore of golden sand. On each side of them, the shoreline disappeared into the hazy distance. Above them, a mighty mountain of rock rose miles into the air. The ceiling of the enormous underground cavern was blocked from view by clouds. Each of these clouds was filled with electrical currents. Silent lightning bolts twisted with one another and shot back and forth across the artificial sky. The action created a very crisp white light that completely lit up the entire cavern. This electric light did not give off any warmth that the sunlight provided. The wind that was created out of this unique atmospheric condition gently blew across the sea. It sent a dash of spray into the professor's muzzle. He licked off the salty moisture and took in a deep breath. The air had a fresh saltiness, along with a slightly electrical scent as well. No doubt it came from the ozone created by the electrical discharges below or above. Well, the professor said, turning back to Axel, do you feel strong enough for a walk down the beach? Certainly, Axel replied. Nothing would give me greater pleasure. Well then, my boy, Professor Lindenbrock said, let us go for a walk. They turned to their left and began to walk along the shore. Hans stayed behind to make camp. Although the professor was the most excited about their underground journey, he did get a certain feeling of comfort from walking in what seemed to be the open air. It's nice to have the sea air ruffling your fur sometimes. Professor and his nephew traveled down the sea's coast. They discussed the different rock formations. They also talked about the possible effects that the Earth's moon had on the tides of a body of water that flowed so deep beneath the surface. The landscape didn't change much until they reached a large indentation in the cavern's wall. In that spot, they discovered a very unusual forest. Strange trees were very tall, smooth, and completely without leaves. The only thing keeping them from being mere poles were the flat, round disc shapes on top of them. To Professor Lindenbrock, they looked like umbrellas. Professor trotted over to get a better look. Axel followed. As they went into the forest and walked underneath the shade cast by the odd-looking trees, the temperature dropped dramatically. There were thousands of these 40-foot-high trees. As the professor got close to one of the trees, he turned to see Axel rubbing his hand along one of the trunks. His hand moved smoothly across the surface. There was not bark on the tree. The professor turned back to give a sniff to the tree nearest to him. A familiar smell came from those towering giants, but the professor couldn't put his paw on what it was. He looked up. Then from what he saw, the answer came to him. All right, see if you can see the picture here, what the trees actually are. What are these trees made out of? So smooth, there's no bark, and it's got an umbrella type top. You want to guess? The professor turned back to give a sniff to the tree nearest him. Okay, familiar scent. All right. He looked up. Then from what he saw, the answer came to him. Axel, he said with excitement, look up, and these mysterious trees will be explained. Axel looked up and a smile came to his face. Do you see the rib shape? Professor asked him. Yes, uncle, Axel replied. Could these really be? The professor finished his thought. Giant mushrooms! Just as the professor had expected, there seemed to be no end to the fascinating discoveries to be made miles beneath the Earth's surface. He put his nose against the stem of the giant mushroom once more and took in a deep breath. There would have been a pretty big pot for the amount of spaghetti sauce it would take to hold one of these mushrooms. Or pizza. Just saying. Hype up. As Professor Lindenbrock was enjoying the strong mushroom aroma, another scent crept into his nostrils. This too was a familiar smell. It was pulling them ever so welcomingly into the source, as if he were in a trance. Professor left Axel to examine the mushroom forest. In doing so, he slowly walked back towards the beach. He finally reached the beach, then raised his nose high into the air. Professor sniffed, then turned left towards the... You wouldn't think they would separate after what just happened, but, whatever. Don't you jump off of here. It's like she gets just as close as possible to ledges so she can just fling herself off and hope I don't catch her. All right. His paws sank a bit into the ground as he climbed the low sand dune. When he reached the top, he saw the source of the enchanting scent. In front of him, lying scattered on the beach, was a huge collection of bones. Professor ran down the side of the dune and dove right into the middle of the bone pile. There were all kinds of bones, big bones, little bones, bones with rough edges, bones with smooth edges, bones with big round knobs at the ends, one so big that you have to open your mouth really wide to chew, and you can't even chew them, you just scrape your teeth down the sides. Uncle? Professor looked up to see his nephew standing on top of the sand dune. He then realized he was lying on top of a pile of bones. Professor had one end of a very large bone resting between his front paws, and the other end... So, here's a question. Does Axel know his uncle is a dog? Or like everybody knows. Anyway, that's fine. No need to ask the question. But depending on the question is going to really depend on what Axel says next. Uncle? Professor looked up to see his nephew standing on top of the sand dune. He then realized he was laying on top of bones. The professor had... Yes, Axel? Professor said, look, another amazing discovery. Axel's eyes moved from his uncle to the bones that were lying around him. He slowly made his way down the dune and said to his uncle, Uncle, he said as he reached down and picked up the bone the professor was chewing, you have discovered the lower jawbone of a mastodon, a creature similar to a giant ancient elephant. I have? The professor asked. He shook his head. For a brief moment, he lost control of his emotions. Yes, I have, he said, fully recovered. There was quite a variety of prehistoric animals that lived and died on these shores. But how can there have been such beasts living in granite caverns? Axel asked. That fact can be explained both simply and geologically, Professor said. It is very possible that above ground many earthquakes took place in ancient times. When the ground opened up, large amounts of soil, along with anything on them, were thrown deep into the earth. But Uncle Axel asked, if these ancient animals survived and used to live in these underground regions, is it possible that one of these huge monsters may, at this very moment now, be still hiding behind one of those mighty rocks over there? Professor Linnenbrock looked in the direction of the boulders. Then he turned back to face Axel. Don't worry, dear boy, he said. It is my strong belief that we are the only animals here today. My strong belief. I'm so comforted. Just based on nothing. Come, Axel. We should leave. Professor started to walk back up the dune. Then he finally backtracked to grab a small bone in his mouth. Finally, he returned to top of the dune. Hey, it never hurts to collect samples, he thought. Together, Axel and Professor Linnenbrock walked quietly back towards their camp. Professor looked around their strange new surroundings. He wondered what the great Saknussemm had thought when he had first set foot in the gigantic cavern. As if to answer the professor's question, a slight breeze blew over his fur. His tail slowly moved back and forth as a feeling of great satisfaction and triumph washed over him. He knew that Arnie Saknussemm would have been proud of what the three travelers had accomplished so far. The silence between uncle and nephew was finally broken when Axel spoke. So, uncle, he said, we have made a great discovery. Great discovery indeed, Professor replied. Axel continued. So, what are your plans for the future? Are you thinking of getting back to the surface of our beautiful Earth? Professor Linnenbrock stopped walking and turned to Axel. Certainly not, he exclaimed. You are surely not thinking of doing anything so silly. He didn't give his nephew a chance to answer. Instead, he started to walk again. My plan is to go forward and continue our amazing journey. We have been very lucky, and in the future I hope we shall be even more so. But Axel began as he followed his uncle. How are we to cross this huge underground sea? It is not my plan to swim across it, Professor said. We will, however, leave our camp tomorrow. What? This time Axel was the first to stop. We are about to cross an unknown sea, where, if I may ask, is the ship to carry us? Professor stopped. With his head tilted slightly, he looked directly at Axel. Well, my dear boy, it will not be exactly what you call a ship. He looked out upon the sea. For the moment, we must be content and build a good solid raft. Axel almost laughed at the idea. A raft? Down here, a raft is as impossible to build as a ship, he said, raising both hands in the air. I'm at a total loss to imagine. The professor didn't let his nephew finish. My good Axel, if you were to listen instead of talk so much. Oh. It's always the people who talk the most. If you would only listen. Oh boy. Instead of talk so much, you would hear, he said a bit impatiently. Well, obviously. Axel stopped talking. From the look on Axel's face, the professor could tell that his nephew was now beginning to hear what he himself had been hearing for quite some time already. In the distance, and when the wind blew a certain way, the faint sounds of a hammer hitting wood could be heard. That sound, Axel began, is the sounds of Hans building a raft, the professor finished. He has been at work for many hours. Professor Linnenbrock turned and trotted towards the hammering sounds. He heard the gritty shuffling of feet in the sand. He knew Axel was once again following him. But where has he found wood to build a raft? Axel asked. Follow me, dear nephew, the professor said, and all will be understood. They walked along the beach for 15 minutes. The hammering sound increased in volume with every step. They passed a small area where Axel had spent time recovering from his accident. Finally, they climbed a small dune. There, they reached the top of the rise. Spread out before them was a great number of tree limbs, joints, and boughs, enough to build a fleet of rafts. In the middle, they saw Hans hard at work on a half-finished raft made from the scattered wood. Axel stared in amazement. Then he asked, where did all this wood come from? The professor ran down the slope. It is mostly fossil wood, he answered. Axel hurried down the dune behind the professor. But uncle, he said, it must be as hard and heavy as iron, therefore it will certainly not float. That would be the case, the professor replied as he trotted over and around the many trunks. Many of these pieces have become fossils, but others have not undergone the change of fossil form. He walked over to a very small branch and sniffed it. But then again, the professor added, there's no proof like a demonstration. Picked up the branch. With a quick jerk, he tossed the branch into the nearby sea. A piece of wood, after having disappeared under a wave for a moment, came to the surface, floated with a rhythmic motion created by the wind and tide. The professor began to climb up the dune. When he reached the top, he turned back to Axel. Come, dear boy, he said in a gentle voice. No doubt your injuries have made you tired and hungry. He then looked out over what he named the Central Sea. The wind gently stroked his fur and blew the pleasing odor of salty water into his nostrils. He kept his gaze on the horizon, but continued to speak to Axel. You must prepare yourself. Then he added, we must all prepare ourselves, for our incredible journey is not over yet. Professor and Axel then headed back to the small cave where their supplies were stored. And that does it for chapter 8. We'll see you next time for chapter 9.